I still remember the exact sound, that soft ping from my system at 11:42 p.m., a login attempt from my workstation. Except, I wasn't the one logging in. My stomach tightened. I froze, watching the small window on my monitor blink. The name next to it made my blood run cold. Ethan. Rivers Company, domain.com.ethanrivers, the CEO's golden boy. 28, overconfident, and completely unqualified. The kind of man who thought charm could substitute for competence. I'd always known he was reckless. But this? Stealing my credentials? That was new even for him. I leaned back, staring at the screen, and let a slow smile form. Because he didn't know that what he had just accessed wasn't real. Those files weren't the confidential reports he thought they were. They were bait. Carefully crafted, fake financial records, counterfeit project data, and ghost supplier contracts. I'd built them months ago, during the first time I suspected someone was snooping through my folder tree. And tonight, my suspicions had found a name. For years, I'd played the role of a quiet operations manager at Lincrest Components, a mid-size manufacturing firm that supplied engine assemblies to multiple automakers. I kept my head down, handled logistics, and delivered results, which made me a favorite among the engineers and a target for the executives, especially for Ethan. He strutted through the office as if he owned not just the company, but gravity itself. He didn't earn his position. He inherited it. Every mistake he made was quietly covered up by someone lower in rank, usually me. But when he stole my login, that wasn't a mistake. That was a declaration. And the best part? I was ready. I had spent the past 3 months building a separate digital sandbox within our shared drive. Same folder structure, same file names, same metadata timestamps. To anyone unfamiliar with the internal workings of our ERP system, it looked identical to the real thing, except the data was poisoned. Deliberately misleading numbers, fake procurement deals, fabricated payments to non-existent suppliers. Each file led to another, a labyrinth of contradictions that would expose whoever touched them as the manipulator. And now Ethan had taken the bait. I didn't panic. I didn't call ET. I didn't even change my password. I simply closed the alert window, exhaled slowly, and whispered to myself, "Let's see what you do with it." The next morning, the office buzzed with the usual chaos. Phones ringing, forklifts humming in the warehouse below, interns carrying coffee trays like battle offerings. When Ethan walked past my desk, he gave me a smug little nod, the kind of expression only someone guilty could wear and still think they were clever. His eyes gleamed with the false confidence of someone who believed he was finally one step ahead. I smiled back, because I knew tomorrow would be fun. He had no idea the files he'd stolen weren't company gold. They were landmines disguised as treasure. And by the time the board reviewed what he presented, every fabricated number would point straight back to him. When I first joined Lincrest Components, the company was a well-oiled machine, disciplined, process-driven, proud of its reputation for precision. It was the kind of place where every bolt was accounted for, every delivery tracked, and every mistake traced back to a name. I thrived there. I'd started as a junior procurement analyst, working 12-hour days and solving problems that weren't even mine. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because order calmed me. Chaos, on the other hand, made me restless. So when the board promoted me to operations manager, I became the quiet backbone of the plant. I handled supplier audits, shipment, schedules, ERP reconciliations, things no one really noticed until they went wrong. And nothing went wrong under my watch, at least not until Ethan arrived. The CEO's son joined for exposure, as they called it. A polite way of saying he needs a title, but no real responsibility. He was given a corner office, a shiny badge, and a salary that would make senior engineers blink twice. His title, Director of Strategic Innovation. That title had no definition, no deliverables, and no limits, which meant he spent most of his time walking around looking important. In the beginning, I tried to be patient. He'd hover near my desk, asking naive questions about procurement flows and supplier margins. I'd explain everything carefully, like a teacher talking to a distracted student. He'd nod, pretending to absorb it, then disappear, only to present my exact explanations as his new strategy at management meetings. At first, I let it slide. I'd learned early that in corporate life, ego often screams louder than truth. But soon, it became clear that Ethan's ambition wasn't harmless. He wanted credit. And when credit wasn't enough, he wanted control. He began demanding access to restricted systems, vendor accounts, logistics dashboards, confidential cost sheets. He'd send IT requests using his father's name as leverage. When they refused, he'd hover around people like me, watching, waiting. The first real red flag came during a quarterly report review. The CEO praised Ethan for streamlining supply chain, redundancy, a phrase I'd written in my memo 2 weeks earlier, the exact same phrasing, down to the comma. My coworkers glanced at me, some smirking, others sympathetic. I just smiled, pretending not to care. But something inside me cracked that day. A quiet shift from patience to calculation. If he wanted my ideas, he could have them. I'd even hand them to him, neatly wrapped, easy to steal. But he'd never know which ones were real. So I began crafting a digital decoy world, a parallel version of our operations. Same folder names, same templates. But the data, twisted, just enough to look convincing while leading to catastrophic conclusions. Fake supplier invoices with inflated costs, duplicate part numbers that would fail traceability audits, a phantom logistics contract tied to a non-existent carrier. Each false file was like a thread, harmless on its own, but together, a web. And Ethan, ever eager to impress his father, soon walked straight into it. He'd brag in meetings about hidden inefficiencies he'd found in operations. Inefficiencies I knew didn't exist. He used my stolen data to justify pointless process overhauls. Every time he did, I'd watch silently, knowing where that road would lead. I remember one Friday afternoon when he swaggered into the break room, surrounded by interns laughing at his jokes. He caught my eye, raised his coffee cup, and said, "Don't work too hard, Maya. I've got big plans for your department." He meant it as a tease, but it sounded like a threat. That night, I stayed late. Again. I didn't fix his messes this time. I simply refined the bait. I created new audit-ready reports filled with just enough inconsistencies to be plausible. By the end of the week, my decoy folder had more life than the real one. It was a mirror image, and I was the only one who could tell the difference. I thought of it as insurance at first, but deep down, I knew it was something else. The start of a quiet revenge. Because someday, Ethan would cross a line even his father couldn't protect him from. And when he did, I wanted to be ready. And then, that night came. The login alert. The proof. The trap had finally caught its prey. By Monday morning, Ethan's swagger had turned into full-blown arrogance. Word spread fast. He'd scheduled an emergency presentation with the executive board at 10 a.m. New cost-saving strategy, people whispered. Major process breakthrough. I didn't need to ask where his breakthrough came from. I already knew. When I walked past the conference room, I caught a glimpse through the glass wall. Ethan pacing near the projector, his tie loose, confidence radiating like stage light. My spreadsheets, my fake spreadsheets, were glowing behind him. He was showing them off as if they were the crown jewels. I lingered just long enough to hear a few lines. By eliminating redundant vendor layers, we can cut procurement overhead by 14%. Here's proof in the Q2 report. That proof was one of my dummy files, the one referencing a fictional supplier named Delta Assembly Group, complete with forged invoices and a non-existent contact list. I almost laughed. Every number on that sheet would crumble under verification. Every saving would lead straight to a void. But Ethan didn't know that. He was too drunk on validation. When the presentation ended, polite applause followed. His father, the CEO, stood up, pride in his eyes. "Finally, some initiative," he said. Ethan beamed, shaking hands, basking in a glow he hadn't earned. By afternoon, things were already in motion. The finance department began verifying Ethan's new vendor proposal. Emails flew, audit trails activated, procurement was told to prepare migration plans. And I sat at my desk, sipping cold coffee, pretending to review shipment logs. No one looked at me. No one suspected me. But inside, I felt the first ripple of satisfaction. Because soon, they'd realize none of it made sense. Numbers wouldn't reconcile. Vendor IDs would mismatch. Audit codes would fail checksum. And when the smoke cleared, there would be only one person who had touched those files. One login ID tied to every unauthorized download. Ethan Riversacompany domain.com. He thought stealing my access would make him powerful. He never realized it made him traceable. The next morning, I received an internal memo. The CFO demanding a meeting with Ethan and all department heads affected by the new supplier model. That was the first domino, and I sat there, quietly watching it fall. By the time the memo hit everyone's inbox, the office felt like it was holding its breath. Every manager, every analyst, every intern seemed to sense something brewing behind those glass boardroom doors. The corridors that morning weren't filled with chatter, only whispers. Ethan strutted in late, of course. The CEO's son didn't walk. He arrived. He breezed past my desk with a forced grin, phone in hand, pretending to be too busy to notice me. But his eyes betrayed him for a split second, a flash of nerves, a flicker of uncertainty. I almost felt pity. Almost. The meeting started at 9. By 9:20, I got the first text from a colleague inside. CFO tearing him apart. Says the vendor data's fake. I minimized my screen, pretending to type while my pulse pounded in my ears. Another message popped up seconds later. Ethan said you gave him the files. There it was. The betrayal. The inevitable pivot. I'd predicted it down to the minute. He was drowning, and he'd decided to grab the nearest person for air. Me. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from HR. Maya, the board wants you to join the meeting. Right now. When I entered the boardroom, every pair of eyes turned toward me. Ethan sat at the head of the table beside his father, sweat beading at his temple. The CFO's laptop was open, filled with audit trails and login logs. Ms. Patel, the CFO began, his tone sharp but not hostile. We've found multiple irregularities tied to your user credentials. Can you explain why files under your account were accessed for non-existent suppliers? I met his gaze calmly. Because someone else accessed my account. Ethan scoffed, but it came out shaky. She's lying. She shared those reports with me. I turned to him, my voice low but steady. You mean the reports you downloaded at 11:42 p.m.? From my system? Without authorization? The CFO's eyebrows lifted. You have proof of that? I nodded. Every system alert is timestamped. ET has it. If you check the security log, you'll see which device the login came from. Ethan's composure cracked. This is ridiculous. You're trying to frame me! But his father's silence said everything. The CEO wasn't defending him anymore. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. The CFO opened another file on his laptop and spun it toward the room, a printout of the access logs. The room fell silent. There it was. EthanRiversCompanyDomain.com, accessing my folder, downloading files, even editing metadata to hide his trail. Except he'd done it all under my bait system. I don't understand, Ethan muttered, eyes darting across the screen. These are your numbers, Maya. Your reports. I leaned forward just enough for only him to hear me. No, Ethan, they're your mistake. The CEO finally spoke, his voice low and trembling with quiet anger. Do you have any idea what this means? Those reports went to investors, Ethan. You used falsified data in a quarterly review. The CFO added, if we hadn't caught this before the audit, could have triggered a compliance investigation. Ethan stammered something incoherent, a mix of excuses and desperation. But no one was listening anymore. The illusion had shattered. As the meeting adjourned, HR asked me to step outside. "We'll need to verify your claim with IT," they said gently. I nodded, pretending to be calm. But inside, adrenaline hummed through me like electricity. By lunch, IT had confirmed it all. The access was traced directly to Ethan's laptop. The dummy files had fooled him so perfectly that even the metadata matched his browsing pattern. The final blow came that afternoon. An emergency internal memo. Ethan Rivers suspended pending investigation. When I read those words, I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just sat there, staring at the screen, hands trembling slightly. Because I realized something deeper. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about exposure. The empire his father had built on favoritism and facade had finally cracked. And Ethan's arrogance had been the hammer, and that was only the beginning. Tomorrow, the real fallout would begin, and this time it wouldn't stop at the CEO's son. After Ethan's suspension, the building felt hollow, like the eye of a storm. People whispered in corners, eyes flicking toward the executive wing. But the thing about storms is they reveal what's been hidden. That was my plan. Not to rage, but to let the floodwaters wash the rot away. I knew I couldn't rely on luck. The board would scramble to protect the company, the CEO would try to close ranks, and legal would circle like guards. So I built the plan in careful, small steps. Surgical, not theatrical. Step 1 was containment. I went to IT under the pretext of helping with a follow-up integrity check. My friend on the security team, Aisha, knew my work and my patience. I asked her to run a full forensic snapshot of the folders Ethan had accessed, and to preserve the chain of custody for every file. We needed an unbroken trail from Logan to download to any outward distribution. She agreed, and that evening she handed me the encrypted logs, eyes saying what words wouldn't. Be careful. Step 2 was leverage. I quietly contacted the head of internal audit, a blunt woman named Claire who hated corporate gloss more than most people hate injustice. I didn't accuse anyone. I gave her facts, timestamps, the dummy files list, and a question that sounded simple but pushed her curiosity. If these vendor IDs don't match, where did these invoices go? Claire's eyes narrowed. She didn't need more persuasion. While they reviewed, I started planting small, verifiable whispers in places that would force official attention without looking like sabotage. A carefully worded note left for procurement. Delta Assembly contract discrepancies flagged. Please confirm supplier bank details. A copied email to finance. Unusual payment routing on line items. Are these approved carriers? The goal wasn't to lie. The bait was already true. It was to direct trained eyes where they needed to look. Step 3 was allies. I reached out to 2 senior engineers in the plant who had always respected me, Luis and Priya. I told them very little, only what they needed. To freeze any implementation of Ethan's proposed supplier changes, and to preserve their own procurement receipts for audit. They complied without drama. In my world, silent, competent allies were worth more than speeches. Step 4 was escalation with control. I drafted a concise, evidence-based memo for the audit committee outlining potential regulatory exposure, procurement fraud, compromised supplier traceability, unexplained vendor payments. I did not attach the dramatic language everyone wanted. This was professional, cold and precise. The aim was to force a formal external audit without hysteria. I also sent a separate note to legal. Request an external compliance firm for an independent review. That step would put the investigation outside the CEO's immediate influence. All this had to look like corporate caution, not personal vengeance. If the board perceived my actions as petty, they'd bury it. So everything read like duty. Risk mitigation, investor protection, fiduciary prudence. That night, I slept for the first time in days without my mind running 100 directions. I dreamed of spreadsheets unfolding like map lines, each leading to a single point. In the morning, my inbox contained exactly what I'd hoped. Claire's reply. We're bringing in an external audit. Meet me at 9. When auditors arrived, they did what auditors do. They asked hard questions and followed traces like hounds. The external team took the preserved logs, interviewed procurement, pulled bank reconciliations, and traced payments. It didn't take long for the fake supplier invoices to reveal their true nature: duplicated payment references, null tax IDs, routing numbers that bounced to shell accounts created last year. The auditors moved with that indifferent efficiency that terrified the guilty. But the real turning point came when the auditors, following a money trail, noticed a pattern of small, recurring expense approvals that bypassed usual sign-offs. Those microtransfers, when aggregated, pointed to a single point of authorization that didn't match any listed approvals. When audit asked procurement who signed off on those exceptions, the answer led directly to a discretionary approval cell that reported, oddly, to the CEO's office. I watched the room when that line was read out. Faces went pale. It wasn't dramatic. It was structural. The evidence didn't shout, it documented. And documentation, in a regulated company, has teeth. By the end of the week, the external auditors presented their preliminary findings to the audit committee: unreliable supplier data, questionable payment routing, and a pattern of approvals that violated policy. They recommended an expanded investigation into senior-level oversight and potential conflicts of interest. The board could no longer treat this as a junior snafu. The CEO's hands were tied by documents he couldn't unwrite. Ethan had been the first domino. My bait had been the match. But the audit had done what secrecy never could. It made the company itself demand the truth. I didn't celebrate. I made coffee and sat quietly at my desk, watching colleagues sift through memos. Revenge had never been about spectacle for me. It was about restoring order, exposing how comfort and nepotism had warped process until it became dangerous. The plan had worked because it appealed to the thing every company feared most: exposure. And when exposure comes with facts, the powerful find very little shelter. Tomorrow they would start asking harder questions, and the answers would not be mine to control. I had only lit the lantern. Now the auditors would walk through the dark rooms and list everything they found. By Monday morning, the building felt tense in a way that made everyone move slower, speak quieter. The auditors had finished their preliminary review over the weekend, and the board meeting to discuss their findings was scheduled for 10 a.m. I arrived early, pretending to check shipment schedules, though my heart was quietly racing. Every step I'd taken over the past weeks had led to this moment. I didn't need to speak. I just needed to be present as the consequences unfolded. The CEO entered the boardroom first, his usual composure replaced by tight lips and a furrowed brow. Ethan followed, hands shaking slightly as he tried, and failed, to project confidence. The auditors laid out the findings with clinical precision: unreliable vendor data, phantom supplier payments, approval chains that violated company policy, and logs tracing every mistake back to Ethan's unauthorized access. A hush fell over the room. Every director, every manager stared at Ethan, then at the CEO, realizing the scope of what had nearly happened. The room was silent, except for the steady voice of the lead auditor, pointing out exactly where responsibility lay. Ethan's protests came too late, his voice weak and wavering. I didn't know," he stammered. But the evidence was overwhelming. Every fabricated number, every invalid entry, every misrouted payment had been traced and verified. And the CEO? He sat frozen, staring at the report as if it had physically struck him. No amount of authority or charm could rewrite the audit trail. The Golden Boy had failed spectacularly, and his father's empire was forced to reckon with that failure in real time. I watched silently from my desk, feeling a strange calm. The trap had snapped shut, but it hadn't been loud or messy. It had been precise, inevitable, and complete. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply appeared in the form of irrefutable facts. The first wave of fallout had begun, and I knew the next dominoes would continue to fall, shaking the company to its core. By the end of the week, the office had changed. The whispers and sideways glances were still there, but now they carried a different weight, a mix of caution and respect. People knew the board had taken the auditor's findings seriously, and the fallout from Ethan's recklessness was clear. Ethan was officially removed from any operational responsibilities. His suspension had been extended pending further review, and every attempt to regain credibility had failed. The board demanded stricter oversight, tighter approval processes, and an immediate review of all executive-level access. My careful planning had forced a system-wide audit, leaving no room for shortcuts or favoritism. The CEO, once untouchable in his corner office, spent hours in closed-door meetings with auditors, legal teams, and department heads. I could see the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He no longer looked at me with the casual disregard of a subordinate. There was a quiet acknowledgement there, unspoken but unmistakable. For me, the victory wasn't about humiliation. It was about restoring balance. The company, which had once run on nepotism and unchecked arrogance, was now being held accountable. Systems were corrected, processes tightened, and the phantom vulnerabilities I had exploited were now visible to the right people. I continued my work as usual, but the atmosphere felt different. My colleagues glanced my way with a subtle nod of approval, a recognition that I had acted with both intelligence and restraint. I hadn't boasted or taken credit publicly. The facts spoke for themselves. Even Ethan's absence was a lesson in silence. His attempts to manipulate, to shortcut, and to steal credit had been undone not by confrontation, but by patience, strategy, and evidence. The dummy files I'd created had done more than trap him. They had forced the company to correct its own flaws. As I sat at my desk on Friday evening, I looked out over the plant floor. Machines hummed steadily, shipments were on track, and the chaos that once threatened to topple operations was now contained. I allowed myself a small private smile. Revenge, I realized, doesn't always need to be explosive. Sometimes it's quiet, deliberate, and inevitable. A series of small actions, perfectly timed, can bring about justice more effectively than anger ever could. And in this case, the arrogance of one spoiled heir had set the stage for a transformation that no amount of privilege could undo. As I shut down my computer that Friday evening, the office felt unusually quiet. The hum of machines in the warehouse below was steady, familiar, grounding. I leaned back in my chair, letting the events of the past week settle in my mind. The victory wasn't loud. There were no dramatic confrontations, no office-wide spectacles. It was quieter, subtler, and somehow far more satisfying. Ethan's arrogance had been his undoing, but it wasn't me who had destroyed him. It was the system, the rules, and the evidence I had meticulously arranged. I had only guided it. I thought about the lessons I'd learned, about patience, precision, and the power of subtle strategy. Revenge, I realized, is not always about fury or visible retaliation. True revenge can be as quiet as a shadow, and as inevitable as a rising tide. It's about planting seeds that bloom at the exact right moment, exposing wrongdoing without stooping to chaos. Watching the board handle the fallout was a revelation. Authority, even inherited authority, is fragile when challenged by facts. One careless decision, one act of recklessness, like stealing access to files without understanding their true nature, can unravel years of privilege and blind confidence. And yet, those who remain calm, deliberate, and observant can shape the outcome without ever raising their voice. I reflected on the CEO, too. His son's mistakes forced him to face uncomfortable truths about how the company had been managed. It wasn't just about one spoiled heir. It was about accountability at every level. No amount of influence or charm could protect negligence once the facts were undeniable. And in that silence, justice unfolded naturally. As for me, I returned to my work, unnoticed, yet quietly respected. Colleagues offered subtle acknowledgments. A nod here, a whispered compliment there. I didn't need public praise. I had orchestrated balance, corrected systemic flaws, and allowed consequences to follow their course. That was reward enough. Before leaving, I glanced at Ethan's empty desk. His chair was pushed in neatly, his computer screens dark. He had learned the hard way that shortcuts, theft, and arrogance leave traces. And in the corporate world, traces don't disappear. They accumulate, waiting for someone patient and strategic enough to notice. I realized revenge doesn't always arrive with fire or fury. Sometimes it comes through evidence, through foresight, through carefully placed truths that expose those who thought they were untouchable. Sometimes It's the quiet restoration of order that leaves the deepest mark. I packed my bag, turned off the lights, and walked through the empty office. Outside, the city buzzed on, oblivious to the lessons learned within these walls. I smiled faintly, knowing that patience, strategy, and precision had done what anger never could. This is Karma Unfolded, where every secret finds its reckoning. Don't forget to subscribe